like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kyle Dugdale, who is an architect, a historian, and a senior critic at the Yale School of Architecture, who has also taught at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. He has written extensively on architectural claims to metaphysical significance, and he has a specific interest in monuments as markers of identity, aspiration, and belief. He has published extensively with his most recent book titled Architecture After Thought.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to join me. It's a real treat for me to be here. So in October of 1911, the onboard newspaper of the Hamburg America line, which offered steamship service from Germany to New York City, printed an anonymous article that gave passengers a stirring introduction to their approaching destination. I quote, "In describing New York, none other than superlatives will suffice. It is an area the largest city in the world. The gigantic office buildings of the business districts are among the modern wonders of the world. There are none to compare with them. Their foundations are sunk deeper toward the center of the earth. Their summits are uplifted higher towards the heavens. The largest steamships afloat make New York their port, and on the deck of the incoming ship, the world traveler beholds the towering bulk of Manhattan with amazement. Great and surpassing as the city is, each year adds to its material greatness and commanding influence." Now this is New York City operating as an icon of modernity. New York is a window into the glorious promise of the future. New York, the world city, the city as an introduction to America itself, a nation understood to combine optimism with a corresponding capacity to make big plans. Here we are, a century later, in New York City. Now this particular article was popular. We find it circulating internationally with necessary adjustments for the better part of 3 decades. It appears most frequently in a guidebook issued repeatedly over several years entitled New York, the Metropolis of the Western World. And there, as elsewhere, the description of New York is accompanied by an image of downtown Manhattan, seen from the water, one of several available panorama photographs, which this one is an example. And this is in fact the vision of the American city that presented itself to the approaching traveler across the early decades of the 20th century. It's directly comparable to the vision documented a few years later in the German architect Erich Mendelssohn's celebrated Amerika Bilderbuch eines Architekten, the American Architect's Picture Book, so translated more recently to English. A vision of towers, I quote again, rising up, stretching into the sky. The equivalent photographs taken in 1924 on the right are there captioned the world center, the financial center. In this preface, Mendelssohn documents the physical power with which Manhattan's towers suddenly thrust themselves into the sky above the horizontal line of the sea voyage. In the subsequent paragraph, he adopts a familiar metaphor, describing the international city of New York as a Babel-like cauldron. And the primary reference there is no doubt linguistic, confusion of tongues that Mendelssohn had spoken on city streets. It's immediately followed by a lingering memory of Genesis 11's architecture. The biblical tower that aspired to establish its own identity by turning itself into an icon. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. It's effectively the story of an effort to build a stairway to heaven through sheer constructive effort, through architecture. The story of the attempt to substitute the physical for metaphysical. Famously, it's a failed attempt. Eric Mendelssohn was not alone in drawing these observations, standing on the deck of the same steamship, the SS Deutschland, in October 1954. The filmmaker Fritz Lang, too, watched the approach of Manhattan. Like Mendelssohn, he was deeply struck by this image of the city's power. And his impressions would find their way not only into the pages of America, in which some of the pages are his, but also into the Architecture's 1927 film Metropolis. As he put it later that year in a personal account of his experience, where is the film about one of these Babylons of stone calling themselves American cities? Now, both of these texts, New York Metropolis and the Western world, America, New York is granted global significance as a model city, an archetypal city, a pattern for the future. It is, and I quote again, the growing and expanding New York of the present, the metropolis of America, from which is emerging that city of the future, which shall be the metropolis of the world. Yet, the superlatives are tinged with anxieties. One of those anxieties today is in the earlier part of the 20th century, has to do with the shape of the sacred. It used to be the case, as you can see in this 1876 panorama photograph, it used to be the case that the highest point in New York City, the first man-made object on the continent to be visible to the approaching traveler, was the 280-foot Gothic spire of Wall Street's Trinity Church. And in this regard, the city of the future maintained continuity with the historic cities that had been left behind in Europe. Cities in which the tower of the cathedral takes on a metaphorical significance as that which provides a center, that which holds the city together as a community gathered around a larger commitment to the God of its ancestors, just as the rooftops cluster around the cathedral tower that rises above them. But suddenly in New York City, this is no longer true. Within a remarkably short period of time, the spire of Trinity Church is no longer visible on the city skyline. It's literally overshadowed by newer architectures. And this is not just an accident of architectural history or of technological progress. New architectures, those brighter towers, visible, bright, are fully deliberate expressions of the city's commitments. They too act as metaphors. Metropolis of the Western World describes Trinity Church as having been dwarfed by the surrounding office buildings which tower above the spire. And here the publishers reproduce a famous 1915 photograph by Irving Underhill, which you're looking at in the center, silhouetting Trinity's dark spire against the sheer walls of a ring of towers that culminate in the mass of the newly constructed Equitable Life Insurance building. This, the largest office building in the world, as it is advertised, and the first to incorporate steam passenger elevators, so a contender for the disputed title of the world's first skyscraper, is built by a culture that now places its trust not in the God of Israel, but in the calculated pooled risk of a commercial life insurance company. A comparable photograph is offered by Mendelssohn, too. You see that same dark masonry mass in the foreground, with the bright towers of modernity rising behind it. And these images represent a precise inversion of the city crown Stadtkrone principle, understood by the German architect and theorist Bruno Taut, to define the relationship between the cathedral and the historic European city. But as Taut is aware, this represents the future not only of America, but also of Europe, that the cathedrals no longer represent the aspirations of the city. This shift finds expression in an early storyboard drawing for the set of Lang's film Metropolis, drawn in 1925 by the art director and architect Erich Kettelhut. It too represents a Gothic spire dwarfed by the surrounding office buildings. But Lang has redlined the church, as you can see here, crossing it out, and writing above it the words Kirche fort, dafür Turm Babel. Out with the church, substitute Tower of Babel. The drawing's subsequent revision shows a new Tower of Babel, marking the center of Lang's metropolis. Upper landing deck, cantilevers from the tapering shaft of its principal structure, similar to the structure that would dominate Lang's film as it was released in 1957, shown here on the right. So that the upper reaches of this Tower of Babel are a little closer to the vignette in the upper corner of the 1919 sketch by Taut, how closer that is to the image of Modernity's city crown. Even in that 1908 panorama of Lower Manhattan, Trinity's crowning position has been usurped by the 612-foot tower, the singular manufacturing company headquarters, rising above the city, claiming at that moment to be the tallest building in the world. Out with the church. It's described in the metropolis of the Western world as a house founded on a rock. A phrase referring in this instance not to the familiar New Testament parable, but rather more literally to the building's structural foundations. Physical, that is, has been neatly substituted for the metaphysical. Contemporary rendering, published in a celebratory account of the tower's conception, a vanity publication, neatly illustrates the implied vertical hierarchy of commercial, governmental, and religious architectures. After the approaching steamship passenger, all of this might have served as a reminder of a passage from Friedrich Nietzsche's Gay Science, a passage that describes a modernity that is abandoned for God of its early chapters. Modernity for whom that God is no longer the defining center of reality. It's a passage known as the Madman, announcing the death of God and ushering in modernity's search for surrogates for traditional theological and cosmological narratives. After all, it's Nietzsche who states most clearly in 1886 that, I quote, "the greatest recent event, that God is dead, is already beginning to cast its first shadows over Europe." And also, we might add, over America. It describes the condition of modernity that is effectively adrift on the sea. "Where is God?" cries the madman. "I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? Aren't we straying as though through an infinite nothing? Isn't empty space breathing at us? God is dead. We have killed him. How can we console ourselves? Murderers who will wipe this blood from us." Now, I would argue anxiety over efforts to re-establish a meaningful landmark on that empty horizon underlie a good part of the collective architectural efforts of the Europeans of the 20th century. There are any number of schemes that come to mind here, not least in Germany during the immediate aftermath of World War I, when modernity's destructiveness was especially palpable. We might point to the visions of the architects of expressionism, many of them finding expression in the form of crowning crystals and soaring towers, or the programmatic ambitions of the Bauhaus, illustrated through Lionel Feininger's famous woodcut of the new cathedral, rising toward heaven in an expression of upward, unbridled aspiration, still assuming the familiar shape of the sacred, but evidently seeking to serve as the articulation of a new faith. Or more explicitly, Bruno-Tart's 1990 monument to the new law, itself a veritable babel of conflicting aphorisms. We could extend this list, and I refer at this point to my book, Architecture After God, of which my publisher would encourage you all to buy multiple copies. But the fact is, these were decades of anxiety. They brought to a head the search for surrogates for traditional sacred forms, the search for new and explicitly modern cathedrals that might anchor the 20th century's faith in its own future, that might protect it from its own evident self-destructiveness, that might offer substance in a context where older theological commitments seem to have lost their hold. That search was not, I might add, an altogether successful search. And the story I tell leads also to the monstrous, rebellic architectures of the Third Reich. And yet it has to be said that the search is ongoing. After all, if we return to this image, we have to admit that today these historic structures seem positively quaint. New York City has continued its upward rise. And let's be clear, the very tallest of the towers that define the city's skyline have nothing to do with pragmatics. And everything to do with the metaphorical significance of height. That is certainly true for the recent rash of residential towers that has spread below Central Park. For our purposes today, I might note that at the moment when they opened, the Twin Towers of Minoru Yamasaki's World Trade Center of 1973 constituted the world's tallest buildings, articulated in a modern Gothic vocabulary. And they were built of aspirations, just as much as the Twin Towers of any older Gothic cathedral. They were intended to constitute the center of world trade, yes, making New York City the center of the world, an axis mundi of sorts, but also, and we can collect these ambitions, a New York icon, an impetus for economic revitalization, a symbol of America's economic power, a physical expression of world peace, a beacon of democracy, and even in the architect's own decidedly awkward words, Mecca. But the architecture succeeded, I suppose, is open to debate. The critic who is known for famously denounced the project in 1974 as an example of purposeless giantism and technological exhibitionism. I might argue that his critique was self-negating. What are we to do with this? I want to end with the question of the shape of the sacred, particularly with the architecture of St. Nicholas. Church of St. Nicholas is not Trinity Wall Street. For one, it's not Gothic, although it betrays memories. But it doesn't, in a sense, carry with it the burden of the Gothic. The history of Gothic architecture is, among other things, the history of a competition for height. As I understand it, medieval cathedral builders of Europe were keenly aware of the height of other cities' towers, and yes, their cathedrals may have been built to the glory of God, of a God beyond all measure, but they were also built to establish their own glory. Architecturally, this competition produced spectacular results. Yes, the cathedrals served to gather around them their respective communities. They did serve as city crowns. But I've always been inclined to think that these physical triumphs came at the cost of other more strictly metaphysical, even theological influence. To the best of my knowledge, even in its prior home, St. Nicholast Church did not aspire to the competition for height. In a way, its architecture belongs less to the story of Manhattan and more to the story of Byzantium. It also belongs to the story of the very early church, of those first century congregations that met in what were essentially private homes. Look for accounts of St. Nicholas' older building, you'll read that the church, I quote, was notable for its small size, juxtaposed with the skyscrapers beside it, not least the World Trade Center. There's a way, I think, in which even then it spoke to different priorities. It did so quite clearly. It strikes me that this aspect of its identity has been preserved. Today, St. Nicholas does not compete with the towers of corporate influence, at least not on their terms. Success will be measured in other dimensions. We may instead take on with equal determination different tasks, one that can safely abandon the search for height and power in favor of a quieter, perhaps more enduring presence of the city. Sure, this building is not visible from a great distance. You have to approach it in person. And it speaks to you not at the scale of a global corporate idea, but at the scale of your individual humanity. By day, it possesses a quiet solidity that stands in contrast to the shiny reflectivity of the glass skyscrapers behind it. By night, it lights up, yes. It glows within the darkness, but even then its brightness is not quite the glassy transparency of the corporate towers, an iconic transparency that is ultimately always disappointing, precisely because its promise falls flat behind the sheet glass that is laid bare as simply the world of office furnishings or profits. St. Nicholas, this banal transparency is replaced with luminosity of stone. Luminosity that invites you to enter, such that it is only within the space of the interior that you may discover iconicity of a different order, a different sort of icon, one that operates as a window into a more substantive reality.